Hello, everyone. My name is Raphael from ZL Tech, and I'll be hosting today along with Michael Sampson from Osterman Research. Before we begin, I just want to let everyone know you're free to submit questions during the webinar using the Q&A button on the Zoom window. We have quite a few people that have joined us today, so we'll try to do our best to answer all of the questions that are submitted. If we do run out of time, though, during the Q&A, we'll have someone from ZL Tech follow up directly via email. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, I probably don't have to tell everyone here about the explosive rise in collaboration apps such as Microsoft Teams. After 2020, these apps have become pretty ubiquitous across all industries. In addition to Teams, Microsoft continues to lead the industry to support a more remote workforce using a number of connected apps where they created their cloud ecosystem called Microsoft 365. Previously, that was known as Office 365. So while convenient, these apps now have to be maintained and supported to adhere to a growing list of compliance requirements like FINRA, CCPA, GDPR, as well as an ever-growing list of international regulations that companies need to know to stay ahead. Now, emails have long been the subject of these regulations in regards to things like compliance, e-discovery, and privacy, but collaboration apps pose a new challenge because they haven't been fully addressed. They're under the same sorts of requirements, though, that traditional emails fall under. Now, to find out how organizations are responding to these new challenges, we partnered with Osterman Research for their latest report. Now I'll bring it over to Michael from Osterman Research to walk us through the methodology first, and so we can understand how the survey was conducted and get a sense of who was surveyed.
Thanks, Raphael. Good to be here. Osterman Research is a market research and consulting firm focused on areas like cybersecurity, data protection, and information governance. And over the last several years, we've done a number of research reports on Office 365, the opportunities for supplementing its capabilities. And in the latest report that we did on archiving and data protection with Microsoft Teams, we took a deep dive into the current status of how organizations were approaching these issues with Teams. We ran a survey for this report. There were 142 respondents to the survey. The condition was that all respondents had to be using Microsoft Teams and also that they were familiar with how Teams was managed in their organization. A second requirement beyond just respondents is that they worked at organizations with more than 100 employees, which in some ways feels like a very low number. Actually, when we looked at the average across the 142 respondents, the actual number of employees excuse me, across all those organizations was slightly over 17,000. And the final requirement in order to participate in the survey was that the respondent needed to work in one of 6 industries. Those are listed there: energy, utilities, financial services, government, and so on.
All right, so can you give us a little bit of insight on what you found out about the adoption of some of the different tools and how their use has spiked in the last year?
Yes, indeed. So 100% of respondents were using Microsoft Teams. We also asked about usage of other tools across the organizations. And you can see in this slide here that in addition to 100% of organizations making use of Teams, 73% of organizations also made use of Zoom, 48% also made use of WebEx, 34% of Citrix LogMeIn, and so on, down to 24% also making use of Slack. So there's a plethora of tools in place across the market, and there's a plethora of tools that were currently being used across the organizations for the people who took our survey.
Okay, so what does the rate of adoption of these different tools mean on a more practical level in regards to data?
From a compliance perspective, from an archiving perspective, from an e-discovery point of view, I think it's fairly logical that data subject to compliance is now flowing from multiple tools. It's no longer just about, are we capturing and looking after the email conversations that we have and looking at email as the only business communications record that is in place, but we now have data that's coming from Teams, data that's coming from Slack, data that's coming from all of the other non-sanctioned tools that are in use across the organization that people are using for day-to-day business. There's a sense of growing data volumes, particularly as tools like Zoom and Teams give really easy access to video and voice capabilities. It seems like no one invites me to a phone meeting anymore. Everything is by Zoom. And so previously, the amount of traffic that would be sent back and forward and the size of the files that would be generated was quite low because it was just email and then a phone call. But now we've got these gigabyte recordings of Zoom meetings that need to be tracked and managed. We would argue that tool-specific approaches don't scale. If you're just looking at if you only have a single tool, the capabilities that come with a single tool would be fine. But as soon as you start getting this plethora and explosion of tools, the ability to manage appropriately from a compliance, e-discovery, archiving perspective becomes much more important. And finally, whatever happens going forward with the usage of Teams, there's this content residue from the rapid explosion of usage in 2020 that organizations will need to deal with.
Okay, so I know that in the white paper you asked about the 5 incident types and how each incident required Microsoft Teams data. Can you talk us a little bit through those findings?
Sure, thanks, Raphael. We asked about the following 5 incidents and whether the respondents to our survey had seen any of these happening in their organization in the previous 12 months. You'll see here that 75% of respondents had experienced at least one of the 5 incidents in the list that we have here. The 2 top ones were the e-discovery request required access to Microsoft Teams content. And first equal place with that was an internal investigation required access to Teams content. 30% we had to produce evidence for a regulatory audit. 27% one or more employees used Teams to attempt to circumvent compliance requirements. And, it's interesting that it's only 27%. I'm pretty sure that that number is actually higher, but of course, this is only for the respondents that had the ability to detect that such behavior was going on. And then finally, 24%, one or more employees use non-sanctioned tools to circumvent compliance requirements or to attempt to circumvent compliance requirements, because you have to say the same thing. It's only for respondents that had the optics to be able to identify this that could answer in the affirmative in the survey.
So my understanding is that there's a definite need here to be able to capture, retain, and search through all of this data for a host of different reasons then.
Well, there's the compliance reasons that you've talked about.
Right.
There's the e-discovery reasons that are here. There's the internal investigations issues that we have. And I think there's a growing sensitivity across a growing list of sensitive issues in organizations that if you don't have the ability to capture and archive and see what's going on and discover and supervise those communications just from an internal point of view, you're putting your organization at significant risk.
Interesting. So switching gears a little bit, I would like to talk some about how the survey respondents view their specific capabilities in addressing some of the use cases that we've discussed.
Okay, great. So we asked about the efficacy of the native archiving and retention tools in Office 365, Microsoft 365 to address the requirements that respondents felt they were under from a compliance, e-discovery, internal investigations point of view. 47% of respondents said that they believed third-party archiving tools were superior to the native tools that Microsoft offered. Slightly fewer than that, 46% believe that the native archiving tools offered by Microsoft were sufficient to meet the requirements today. The most interesting transition in this slide is the drop from 46% saying we believe it's sufficient today to 40%, the red bar, saying we believe that it will be sufficient in 3 years' time. And we haven't had time in this call to talk through some of the content types that aren't captured by the native tools, nor how the native tools actually work. But there's this sense in the market that what we have today is not quite good enough, and what we are going to have in 3 years is even going to be worse than what we have today.
Okay. So speaking to this slide, I see between the different categories of respondents, I'm seeing that quite a few have either have considered or would probably are going to consider looking towards maybe a third-party solution to at least supplement their needs in the coming years above and beyond what Microsoft can offer.
Raphael, I think anyone who works in a compliance role is honor bound, just from a professional point of view, to look in detail at what native capabilities are offered in any particular tool. And in addition to that, in parallel to that, not just, that's not the only thing you have to do. You also then have to look at what others offer in terms of dealing with the issues that you're going to face from a compliance perspective. And third-party tools, third-party vendors, have the benefit of elevated focus on a particular area that's really important. And, it might be for some organizations that the native capabilities in Teams are sufficient, but I believe that should come out of a consulting assessment. It should come out of a risk assessment, not out of a, oh, well, Microsoft offers it, it'll probably be all right for us.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some of those drivers then that would motivate an organization to probably look towards a third-party offering. And let's also talk about how you've grouped them for us today.
Okay, perfect. One of the final questions in the survey, and the survey had something like 17 to 20 questions in it, but one of the final questions in the survey was, if you were going to look at a third-party tool for archiving and data protection in Teams, what would motivate you to do that? And there were 10 possible answers to that question, and I've grouped them into 3 separate groups based on the percentage bands that come through. There's only about a 10% variation between the top one at 54% and the least important one at 42%. So they're all fairly close, but there are some themes. And we also don't usually put a decimal point on our charts, but these are so close that I felt that I needed to put that on just to show how close the results were. So in this group one, the top reason by 0.7% was the ability to search in place across multiple platforms and content repositories without having to migrate data to a central repository first. The second reason, there are actually 2 in second equal place, the ability to capture the full range of data types in Microsoft Teams, and there are a range of data types that are not currently captured by the native archiving and retention tools offered in Office 365. So for 53.5% of organizations, they believe this was a highly important issue for them. And then the other one in second equal place was having a single platform for archival, e-discovery, and compliance across both Microsoft and non-Microsoft data sources. And as we've talked about earlier, the vast majority of respondents to the survey had more than just Teams. I mean, clearly they also had email and Teams, but they also had other tools in place, which is where that one in, what's that going to be? Oh, that's the second equal, isn't it? The third item shown there.
Okay, so for organizations that do fall into this first group, there's probably a number of things that I understand they should consider when choosing a third-party solution. So things to consider would be, namely, can I capture all of the data types that I would need outside of the standard Microsoft files and folders? Additionally, do I have access across all of my platforms? Can I access everything inside Microsoft 365 to include things like inboxes and Teams, and still be able to access everything outside of that ecosystem? Now, how about group 2, though? What are those drivers look like?
So again, these are in group 2 because there's not a great deal of variation between the top item here and the 4th item in this list. The top one, reducing the risk that Microsoft's changes to Teams to address end user requirements will undermine compliance capabilities. We had a look at user voice at the top requests by the community in terms of votes for things that had been put in place. And, among the top ones were issues like, I want to be able to delete messages from a private chat. And that's an end user requirement that makes a lot of sense from an end user point of view. But there's a compliance implication for that if someone is able to delete content from a private chat, the organization is then not fulfilling its compliance requirements to capture, to preserve the requirements that the data that needs to be captured. In second place here in group 2 was the ability to set fewer consistent retention policies that cover a wider range of data sources in order to simplify what is happening from a compliance point of view. In fourth place here, in third in this chart, the ability to place targeted legal holds on content in multiple platforms and content repositories. And then the final one in this list of group 2 was the faster removal of messages subject to a deletion retention policy.
Okay, so with this group, they're going to need to consider a different set of questions when evaluating third-party solutions. So things like, can I preserve historical records and apply comprehensive universal policies? Maybe is there a paper trail of the changes that have been made within my organization, and can I audit that at will? So those are a lot of the things that you'd consider, again, for group 2. Finally, I want to move on to the last group, group 3. What do those drivers look like?
Thanks. So again, the difference between the top ranked one at 53.5% and the bottom ranked one at 42.3% is not that great, but this is the group 3 that were fairly close around the 42, 43%. The first issue in group 3 was gaining access to better tools for meeting supervision, things like enhanced workflow, things like improved lexical analysis, things like better sampling. The second one here in group 3 was having a compliance platform and data set that's separate from the day-to-day system used by employees, so that the day-to-day system used by employees can be optimized from a productivity and collaboration point of view, but the compliance, archiving, and data protection platform can be optimized from a compliance point of view. And then the final reason here was moving away from point solutions to archiving and e-discovery.
All right, so with this group, organizations that share the drivers inherent to this group number 3 would probably need to ask a few other questions, things like, can I supervise non-compliant communication? So do I have any sort of active, compliance manager that is able to monitor and alert me of things like policy violations? Do I have the ability to find any and all records? So again, both within that Microsoft ecosystem that we talked about and outside of that same ecosystem. And so this is for people that don't want to be constrained in their ability to search across their organization. So finally, Michael, can you please talk about the conclusions or maybe key takeaways from the survey that you found?
Thanks. So there's a couple here that we'll just touch on very briefly. And we've spoken about some of the survey findings in this. I believe you'll make this recording available, and there's also the white paper that people will be able to download from your website to see the full study. So conclusion number 1, fairly obviously, Teams is being increasingly used across the organization. I don't think anyone foresaw in February of 2020 that we were going to go from something around 30 million people using Teams, to a year later where it's approaching 150 million people. That's just such an incredible explosion in adoption. And we expect to see ongoing usage as organizations adapt to a hybrid workforce model and the implications of that. Compliance remains essential. We can't just give people tools for productivity and collaboration. We also need to meet our organizational requirements around compliance, around archiving, around answering issues from an internal investigation point of view. And there are capabilities in Teams that are ignored from a compliance point of view that are a concern from Osterman Research's viewpoint. And we would encourage, as we said before, I think any compliance professional is honor bound to look at this topic and evaluate the efficacy of third-party tools to better address the compliance capability, the compliance requirements that their organization is under, and make an informed decision in terms of whether what Microsoft offers is sufficient or whether something needs to be added from a better together, embrace and extend point of view.
All right, good to know. Well, thank you, Michael. I think we have time for a few questions that were asked during the presentation. The first one I have here, how did the results of the study compare to where you had expected, and what were the biggest surprises?
You know, as a research analyst, when you go into a study, you expect to see certain things, or you go in believing that certain things will happen based on your understanding of the market space and your previous exposure to people working in that. There were several surprises for me. I was surprised that the survey members that we targeted were doing less capture currently across a range of data types than I thought that they would. The second surprise for me was when we looked at the group one of drivers. The third item in that list, which was second equal, was around having a single platform for multiple data types and systems. And my assumption going into the study was that that would be the top ranked issue by about 70% of the respondents, but it wasn't, and that's fine. And the third surprise for me when I looked at the data that we got back was that when we asked respondents to rank the reasons that they would do archiving and data protection of teams, the top ranked issues were things like meeting compliance requirements, responding to e-discovery requests, and the least ranked driver for doing that was to respond to internal investigations. But then when we asked the question about what incident types have you had over the past 12 months, I was surprised that the rate of incidence of e-discovery requests and internal investigations was exactly the same and tied for first equal place. In other words, there's like the systematic bias against internal investigations that it's not important. And yet it's one of the most important things that's happening, or it's one of the most common things that's happening in organizations today.
Interesting. All right, and I think I have another question here. How do I know if I'm in the 46% of people for whom native Teams archiving is sufficient?
Look, I think there's a couple of answers to that question. First of all, the question was phrased, what's your viewpoint in terms of the native archiving capabilities in Teams, and are they sufficient to your requirements? And so 46% of respondents said, yes, we believe that they are sufficient. Now, the belief that they are sufficient and the reality that they are sufficient are two very different things. From a survey point of view, we can ask, what do you believe? From a consulting, legal, compliance engagement, or formal third-party assessment point of view, we don't have the ability, and the survey doesn't claim to say that it is actually sufficient for 46% of the respondents. We don't have that point of data, but that's the point of data that I believe organizations need to work out for themselves through the right approach of a formal engagement, a formal assessment to figure that out. Now, again, from a surveying point of view, Osterman Research is just about to start into another research program looking at whether, from an information governance point of view, organizations should put all of their eggs into the Microsoft basket. So, we would hope that in 3 to 4 to 5 months, we'd have a better answer to your question on this one. But for the moment, that's really all I can say.
All right. And this question, how can I get buy-in from other departments in my organization? I think I have an idea for this one because, again, reading the white paper, one thing that I remember off the top of my head is legal and compliance professionals were some of the lowest involvement in the decision-making process to adopt Microsoft Teams for their organization, if I'm not mistaken. But people in those positions, they understand how crucial the tools are that allow for more robust search and capture opportunities, and how they can be critical in avoiding things like fees and fines and incidents in regards to adhering to those regulations.
Yes, that's right. That's not something that we talked about in this set of slides today. But when we asked about the roles in organizations that had had influence in the decision to embrace Teams during 2020, the legal professionals, as you've said, as you've good memory here, the legal professionals and the compliance professionals were two of the three least involved groups in that process.
Right.
So if we're going to turn that on its head in 2021 and start dealing with these data types appropriately, then there's a process of outreach, a process of discussions, a process of education and awareness to say, we are using these tools internally, but because they constitute business communications and business records in many situations, we need to do an elevated piece of work around capturing these appropriately, just like we've done for email. And those conversations can only start when compliance and legal professionals go, hey, I have something to add to this conversation. We need to talk through this.
Well, I think that about does it for our time. So again, we'll have to respond by email to any of the questions that went unanswered due to the time constraints. And additionally, we'll also email a link to everyone that attended today, so you can watch and share the recording. If you have any extra questions or comments, you can always email us at info@zlti.com or visit our website, zlti.com. Want to thank Michael and Osterman Research for your time and insight today. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. Just wishing everybody to take care. Thank you.